Hi, everyone. Welcome to TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Of course, today we're here to discuss the failure to hold Libya's elections and renewed risk of conflict. So after more than a decade of conflict and instability, Libya was expected to hold its first presidential election in December 2021. Following weeks of uncertainty, on December 22nd, just 2 days before the scheduled election, the Electoral Board announced its postponement, owing to a lack of preparation and disagreements over the legal basis of the poll. The High National Election Commission suggested January 24th, 2022 as the new date for the polls. However, there has been no agreement about the new date or the electoral procedures, or on even whether the presidential and parliamentary elections should be held on the same day or not. Of course, there continue to be major unresolved issues in the country. These include a lack of consensus on the current constitution, security obstacles, and the presence of polarizing figures, most notably Khalifa Haftar and Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, of course, who are all seeking the presidency. This was only adding to the uncertainty and chaos surrounding the planned election. So joining us today to discuss these and other related issues are Dr. Alessia Malkanji, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and assistant professor at La Sapienza University of Rome, Tim Eaton, senior research fellow, the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and Anas Al-Qomati, director of the Sadiq Institute and Libyan political analyst. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a real pleasure, and we look forward to this discussion. So let's get right into it. And Tim, I'll come to you first. So of course, these long-awaited presidential and parliamentary elections have been postponed, as we've been discussed, to, in theory, later this month. Although of course that's also in question. However, as we mentioned, it's unlikely that some of these key issues are going to be solved in the run-up in the next few weeks to when this proposed new date is actually, might take place. A couple of points here. What could be the impact of a further elections delay on both the political and security level in the country, particularly with reports circulating of militias mobilizing in and around Tripoli and other areas as well? So let's start off with that point.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the invitation this evening. So the elections didn't take place, as we know. Everybody knew they weren't taking place for some time, but nobody was saying it. So the question of what comes next, the announcement of a delay, the proposition of a potential new date, still really, there's not a lot of content to that. And actually, the way that the conversation is now trending is that we're looking at quite a long delay. Talks of a constitution building process coming back to the fore. And of course, that means that there is no clear program for what's going to happen next. And it's clear that we've got many different tracks kind of underway at the current moment. You've got security negotiations going on between certain armed factions. You have political negotiations over the formation of a new interim government to replace the current interim government. And then you have the discussion about what happens to the political track more broadly. And there's a lot of positioning in that. And I think as your question points out, you see a lot of movements. We've seen major Misratan factions bolster their positions in Tripoli. We've seen movements of other Tripoli groups potentially looking to pose a threat towards the existing government. And I think at the moment, we're at this very delicate point where many things are on the table and there's a lot of uncertainty. What I would say is that from previous periods, it doesn't look like we're set for a major outbreak of violence as was seen in, say, 2019. It looks like we could see a lot of sporadic localized violence, which could get out of hand if there is no consensus on how to move ahead. But actually, there is a degree of optimism, I think, in the fact that the tone is relatively modest between the rival actors at the moment. And it looks like they have come to an agreement in a way to stave off the elections, which isn't good for the long-term future of Libya, but may indicate that we're not set for a major outbreak at the moment. Just leaves a lot of uncertainty as to what will happen.
So this point of, I think of consensus is interesting, and we'll come back to that. Anas Al-Qomati, I want to go over to you. The UN, of course, has been pushing these elections as part of a multi-pronged peace effort, pushing for a political solution, of course, going back to October of last year and the ceasefire agreement that was signed. So I'm wondering if you can address a couple issues on this point. One, this idea that where elections fit into sort of this process that Libya is going through right now. Second, in terms of the UN's role, now the elections have been postponed, and as Tim was mentioning, there's no real certainty at this point of when those elections might actually take place. What is the role of the UN likely to be moving forward? Are they likely to be more involved in sort of pushing this roadmap, or are we going to see sort of a pullback from the UN to more of a consultative and facilitation role?
Well, thanks for the question, Michael, and thank you again also for the invitation. I think it's a really good set of questions, because when you go back to October 2020 and we have this ceasefire agreement that was penned between the representatives or some appointed military representatives of the rival factions on the ground, we could even go back to January 2020. I mean, 2 years ago, there was the beginning of this ceasefire process, the beginning of the peace building and state building process called the Berlin process. It was obviously derailed by a number of different circumstances, namely COVID, but also because the actors on the ground and the international actors that were also playing a role on the ground didn't have any consensus. I still don't see much has changed since then. That's the first thing to point out, aside from the fact that there is an agreement to disagree. But there has been no unification efforts. There has been very, very little on the ground that suggests that the irreconcilable visions that were put forward over the last several years have been kind of overcome. And I think that's a major, it's a major problem, because we have certain moments that look optimistic. I mean, the establishment of the government of national unity looked like an optimistic moment, because in theory, you would assume that unity means that the rival factions on the ground have now unified politically. I mean, the very first thing that Tim has mentioned is that today we're considering replacing that government of national unity. So it means that at least one of the actors on the ground is not sufficiently represented, or is not sufficiently included, or more likely in this case is not sufficiently in control of the institutions that matter. And I think that's where this really comes back to the question of, why do we have wars in the first place? You go to war because you want to bend your opponent to your will, and in the negotiations that was the objective. It wasn't a peace building process. We shouldn't call it a peace building process, because this ceasefire has had holes punched all the way through it. There may be some relative calm in the center of the country instead, but we've seen movement across across east and west Libya and south of Libya. Especially, we've seen violence committed several times, including between different rival armed groups, but also against the judiciary over the last several weeks as a result of this build up to the elections. But as I said, there's been nothing on the ground, even politically or militarily, that suggests that these irreconcilable visions have been overcome. The second aspect goes back to what you were talking about in terms of the ceasefire agreement. I mean, since January 2020 or October 2020, or whenever your watch starts ticking on this peace process, there has been absolutely no progress. And I mean, in a meaningful sense, I don't believe that there has been real progress. Most of the deadlines, if not all of the deadlines, have been missed. And that's a major, major problem. In fact, the first part of that ceasefire agreement in October 2020 was to withdraw all of the foreign forces and foreign mercenaries on the ground that, according to the UN, stand at around 25,000. Some, according to the actors themselves, have left. There's no way of identifying that or being assured of that. But in fact, they've missed that deadline. The political process that the UN started with, and I'll move on to this point about what the UN's role has been and what it should be and what it could be. But essentially, the UN's role at the beginning of the year, when it came to build the political track, was to set a timetable for elections and then have these steps that we move towards, so that the elections were free and fair, so that we'd have a completely fresh restart politically, all of the institutions then. And then we would also have this kind of guarantee. I mean, the constitution is not just a box ticking exercise. It's the guarantee that there are rules to the game, that, that the various actors included in government, outside of government, are not going to feel this existential threat from whoever emerges as the victor of the political process, whether it's through appointment, as we saw in the LPDF, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, or whether it's through elections, free or fair or otherwise. The idea of returning to one-man rule is a problem in Libya when you have a tradition for strongmen and people that wipe out their opponents, whether it's through electoral legitimacy or one man's legitimacy or revolutionary legitimacy. That is a trend and a tradition in Libya that dates back, decades. So I think we have to be conscious of what those things are. And so when we look at the timetable, an election was set and a date was set, but then nothing happened, nothing moved forward. The UN facilitator, it was Jan Kubiš, over the last year, resigned around 6 weeks ago because of not only not being able to make progress, but also local actors on the ground that he was engaging just didn't respect this guy. And I think we should call it what it is. And I think that's why we now have the return of Stephanie Williams, the former SRSG, that I think, again, to answer your question, is consulting with these various actors on the ground, but they're not in the same formation as we saw them. If we go back to 2019, the Government of National Accord, the UN-backed government, and the Libyan Armed Forces, the LAF, were involved in this conflict that had been going on for 2 years or 6 years or 7 years, depends again when your clock starts ticking. But let's just give an example of two of the main principal representatives of these two factions. Fathi Bashara on the one side, the Government of National Accord's Minister of Interior, who represented the forces that were fighting against Khalifa Haftar's forces that were invading Tripoli. If you go back to his statements in 2019, Khalifa Haftar cannot be part of a political process. The only way we're going to have peace in Libya is if Khalifa Haftar dies. These are all statements that were made. You can go and check them online. Only last week, or around 10 days ago, we saw Khalifa Haftar and Fathi Bashara shaking hands. So in theory, that handshake should mean that we have some political progress. In fact, he's lost his constituency in Western Libya. Now, the reason why I say that and the relevance of all of that is that, as I said, nothing has changed on the ground. Swords are pointed at each other or guns are pointed at each other, and no one is making any kind of real progress to unify those actors or to look for a form of compromise that leads to cooperation. You've seen compromise. We saw the GNU being formed in March of last year. We saw that being moved forward. But that is now the job of the UN, to facilitate a kind of compromise that leads to cooperation. And we didn't see that in March of this year. We now have a itinerary of issues that go much, much deeper than what they were at the beginning of this year. And I think something has to crack. But it will probably lead to the UN having to make a decision about who it brings to the table, who it doesn't, and what kind of roadmap it has. And as Tim already pointed out, we have a delay, and a delay in mind that now looks like it's going to be counted not by dates, but by big calendar milestones that could take months or years to achieve. A lot of these actors, that are looking for political position at presidential elections are old, very, very old, to put it lightly. I don't think that they have months or years to wait on that. So I think, given what Tim has already said, and I'm in complete agreement, it doesn't look like at the moment that it's a very sturdy kind of atmosphere, because we don't know what could happen. Anything could spring. And as we saw in the last several weeks, and as you pointed out, Michael, the movement on the ground in Tripoli, yes, sometimes it's posturing, sometimes it's opportunistic, but all it needs is one political moment to strike, and it will act like a lightning rod. And we've seen that before. 2011, 2014, 2019, we could see run-of-the-mill violence. We could see a little bit of localized skirmishes, as Tim has said. I agree with that. I think the second alternative scenario is someone comes out of this political process or a new roadmap looking like they have a strategic advantage, an institutional advantage, or one group tries to come through the back door before elections happen. That's the big worry that I have. So I'll paint it in very clear terms. When you come to elect a leader, you elect a suit and tie. You don't get to elect your army. That is the big question today in Libya. Who is going to run the unified military? Is that military going to be a neutral military that is subservient to the state? Or is it going to be, one faction or the other faction is going to have an advantage? Is it going to reflect part of society whilst leaving the other society out? That's what the last 40 years of rule has looked like in Libya. That's a big question today. And unless the UN facilitates those two aspects, whether it gets that balance on the ground, can find this kind of compromise that leads to cooperation, politically speaking, and then can actually work on an institutional level to bridge those divides, can reconcile these two visions that are still irreconcilable as far as I see them. One that wants to build a state around the military, and the other one that wants to build a state that has a unified but subservient military. Unless you answer that question today, you have made no progress. And I think that's where I'll leave it. So more questions than answers, unfortunately, Michael.
No, thank you, Anas. Dr. Malkanji, so building off what our two previous guests have said, obviously it's clear at this point that, even if the elections had taken place, they were unlikely to solve some of these major issues. So following this postponement of the elections, what is the status of the UN-backed peace process? Some have pointed out that perhaps the UN was rushing to secure a political win at the risk of creating further conflict and division. And as our previous speakers have pointed out, not much has changed on the ground in terms of the posturing of the different groups. And as we were discussing, sort of this posturing perhaps shifted from the battlefield to political negotiations around the elections, but it was still sort of this posturing that was taking place. So, given all of this, what is the status of the UN-backed peace process? And would you agree with this sort of criticism that perhaps that this process was rushed in order to secure, political wins?
Thank you, Michael, for this invitation, and good evening to all. Answering to your question, I think that for someone, the UN-backed peace process appears like in a status of agony. Or for someone else, it is in a sort of standby mode. In reality, in my opinion, it's very difficult to make an assessment, also because the scenario is evolving day by day in an extremely unclear way, as my colleague said before. As it is well known, there is an international consensus on the need of holding presidential and parliamentary election on December 24, considered as a fundamental step of the post-conflict roadmap established by the UN. International states want to see election anyway. There was a sort of hyper-focus on the electoral moment as emerged during the November 2021 International Conference for Libya. For sure, the decision to hold election at the end of last year in order to support the peace political process has been hazardous. We know that from the very beginning, and we know that there were huge possibilities of failure. At the same time, all the election, in order to select new institutions legitimized by popular vote, was the only way to make this political reconciliation process acceptable, both at a local and international level. But as in the past, the situation on the ground was not so easy. No, first of all, as a matter of fact, the well-known political, military, and socio-economic problems affecting Libya since the fall of the previous regime still persist. As Tim said before, I think about the need to unify institutions, restore integrity of the central bank, which remains crucial to addressing social economic difficulties. The issue of the withdrawal of foreign military forces and private military contractors, which is currently stalling, and the permanent state of conflict among the Libyan different factions. We consider to have two rival camps, but in reality, there is an extremely fragmentation within them and growing personal ambitions by main political personalities, warlords, etc., etc. And this clearly emerged during the electoral campaign, which saw almost 100 candidates ready to run for the presidential election. Most of them were divisive presidential candidates, such as Saif al-Islam and Khalifa Haftar, and their candidacy further polarized and divided the Libyans rather than unite them in a political settlement. Moreover, there was a hard lack of consensus on the legal framework for the upcoming elections, since the country has not a constitutional basis for the candidacy criteria and for the vote. All these reasons, together with the already present problems, created the perfect storm which led to the derail of the electoral process. Of course, this could be read as a failure for the West and the international consensus. In my opinion, what emerged, as in the past attempts made at an international level to find a viable solution for the Libyan quagmire, is that the international community show again a sort of detachment from the situation on the ground. International actors, of course, pushed for election, also considering the profound disillusion of the Libyans and their need for a return of democratic system. Libyans are already fed up and deeply disillusioned by the distress as a result of the revolution. They need to believe that there is an alternative to the chaos and that they can vote and express their choice. but the situation on the ground is more complex, and sometimes, in my opinion, the international community not have all the elements to profound understand the situation on the ground. I think that Libya needs election, but in this context, extremely divided and polarized, it could risk to further aggravate the already present tension in the country. And of course, this was the result that is under our eye.
Well, Dr. Malkanji, I want to stick with you just for a moment here. To talk a little bit about specifically the international, let's say, rather than UN-backed involvement, but the international interference in sort of the elections and the election process itself. So, obviously, we have multiple international players with varying agendas in the country, which has arguably worsened the divides within Libya itself, and has, let's say, added incentives for factions not to actually come to the table. Given sort of this dynamic, what is the sort of prospects, if we're looking forward to when the elections might actually take place, for foreign interference sort of in the electoral process itself, and what can be done or needs to be done to limit its impact?
Let me start depict a general scenario. So looking at this, I think that 2021 was a year in which we saw a sort of rapprochement and normalization among the principal external actors, which continue to interfere in the Libyan context. This could be read as a good window of opportunity for Libya to set its condition to go to the election and solve the political stalemate. But, in my opinion, the issue we need to consider is that this condition could not survive. I am not sure this rapprochement will continue, and if the tension could increase, I think that this could lead to a renewal of conflict among regional and international actors which have different relevant interests in the countries. Of course, now it's very difficult to say if this condition will remain because there is an increasingly delicate balancing between all the countries. There is a declared convergence on the need to have this election. A statement that hide the persistency of a fundamental disagreement and the presence of different and contrasting interests among these regional actors that, as a matter of fact, represent a threat to any kind of democratic transition. In the past, we have seen how regional meddling worsened the local conflict, trying to transform Libya in a proxy camp. In other moments, like the current one, regional players try to diffuse tension and to limit the clashes on the ground. But what is clear, however, is that the international community and the United Nations have extremely limited capabilities in limiting external meddling or forcing regional actors to find a sort of accommodation or a shared solution for the Libya problems. In this fragile frame, it is important to find the way, like Europe tried to do in the past, to launch an inclusive process taking into account different interests and perception of fear and danger, taking on board all the main actors involved in Libya. This is a difficult, sometimes frustrating effort, but the only viable to diffuse regional interferences. In any case, in my opinion, we should not misunderstand the Libyan scenario, often depicted just like a proxy war. As clearly emerged since the beginning of the crisis, there is a high level of autonomous political and military decision capabilities for the local actors, sometimes diverging from their external supporters. Local actors maintain an important economic, strategic, and political autonomy, and this condition could lead to the possible multiplication of the risk on the ground, especially when the objectives and military strategies of the patron state and their proxies diverge. Local actors appear more willing to privilege their personal ambition, their personal interests over the strategy agreed upon with their external supporters. Of course, those dynamics emphasize the political military instability and amplify the risk of a step back into an open conflict.
Timmy, what do you think about the possibility that sort of in this indeterminate period now until elections may take place, what do you think the possibility of a reignition of conflict amongst, let's say, the international actors in particular, not necessarily with their own, sort of proxy forces on the ground, but a move away from this sort of consensus approach that we've seemed to have at least been going down in the last little while. Perhaps that's not actually the case, but what do you think of the possibility of renewed sort of more active rivalry between international and regional actors with their own interests in the country?
Well, I think in one sense, the presence of the internationals of Turkish armed forces, of Russian mercenaries in central Libya has actually acted as a brake to some of that conflict. Those Russian deployments, in effect, prevented the full collapse of Haftar's forces in 2020, and the presence of Turkish forces in the West as well mean that any kind of major outbreak of conflict on a national level would have to come at such a scale that I don't think that the local actors can bear it. So in that sense, whilst the presence of foreign actors hasn't been beneficial to Libya, in this one limited sense, I think it does reduce the possibility of a broader outbreak of conflict. Moreover, I think that the external backers of Haftar are less willing to put resources behind him in 2022 than they were in 2019 and previously. So that broader conflagration is perhaps less likely. But where we're seeing things really be tense are between local battles between various power centers. So we can see, for example, the mobilizations in Tripoli as being effectively an arm wrestle between the existing Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibeh and those armed factions in Tripoli who would like effectively him replaced, and also, of course, his Misratan rival Fatih Bashaga, who was previously in the government of national accord, but has been advocating a kind of an accord with Haftar and indeed traveled to the east of the country. Bashaga has received some condemnation in his native Misrata for that move. So there are disputes over strategy, and there are disputes over control of areas and who will retain power. In the south, for example, we've also noticed that there have been elements of Haftar's armed forces that have been in dispute with local constituencies, and the return here of Saif al-Islam and his potential to peel off elements of Haftar's forces and support base is another source of potential escalation. So we see these threats everywhere. But really the challenge now is, how does this all fit together? Because the elections process was criticized for effectively creating a zero-sum calculation that whoever wins the presidency wins the game. But it also had very limited potential for anybody to win and impose their will for the same reasons I've just mentioned. Power is fragmented among many rival groups within Libya, and it's difficult to see how any one actor could control the whole of Libyan territory. And so really, the discussion we're having now is kind of going on a few levels. On a real sort of realist level, who gets to control the security sector, as Anas mentioned? Could there be a deal with someone like Haftar when his approach has been very clear over the years and has not deviated? His authoritarian and autocratic tendencies. Can you do a deal? You can see that dispute is at the heart of the disagreements between Misratan constituencies right now. Then that discussion is more about, if there is going to be a new government, who's in it? How do we share out the positions? How do we ensure that my group or my constituency is able to retain influence and retain some access to the state's resources? But that's very different to an electoral process, which envisages a kind of foundational moment for a new and democratic Libya, where those things are up for grabs. Effectively, these existing players don't benefit from the uncertainty and have generally preferred to maintain the status quo over an uncertain result at elections. And then we get to the broader conclusion. The problem is not just one actor or another. It's the system of government. It's the lack of consensus, the absence of a social contract over how Libya should be governed. And here's where the discussion of the constitution comes in. And it's a really good discussion to have. It's something that Libya needs. The problem with it is that it's a discussion which has been kind of stalling, stop-starting for over a decade now. It's a very difficult discussion to settle. And it's also a very easy way of railroading a political process. So the existing parliament and the consultative body, the House of Representatives and the High State Council, respectively, have illustrated repeatedly since their founding and their appointment that they have used these types of processes to maintain and elongate their position of power. And so the worry is now that on the one hand, you've got these hard negotiations of how spoils might be divided between respective armed groups and a lot of alliances and counter-alliances being formed. And on the other hand, you've got a political process which might crystallize, which whilst it makes sense in theory, actually won't lead to tangible progress. And so the UN and the internationals then have to figure out where they work into that. Now that the elections date has gone, will they seek to maintain that momentum and hold elections relatively soon by fixing some of the problems around the laws? Or will they actually engage in a broader kind of state building, constitution supporting approach, which will go a lot longer? There are challenges with both. The first is that the laws are going to be difficult to fix, and it's going to be hard to get the polls to take place as freely and fairly as we envisage, particularly in areas, for example, under the control of Khalifa Haftar. But on the other hand, the constitution building process could just resign the whole Libyan population to another elongated transitional phase if it's not meaningfully addressed or, honestly supported. So that's the position we kind of find ourselves in at the moment. And I think it's very unclear which way that's going right now, but probably the next couple of weeks will determine quite a lot of where the UN goes and how the various Libyan actors will position themselves.
Anas Al-Ghamati, I want to get your input on this particular point and this idea that, okay, there is this sort of international, level at play here, and of course there's various support from the various actors to their respective the clients that they support on the ground. But as Tim is pointing out, the sort of major issue now seems to be this sort of lack of internal consensus and this positioning amongst internal players on issues that were never totally resolved. I'm wondering if you can sort of give us an idea of what those major issues are on the ground, and what is the likelihood of actually addressing them one by one in the months to come.
Where to start? Essentially, because there is, like I said, a list that could go as long as you want. I think I would start by conceptualizing them as structural problems, because the major problem that I find, and the reason why I keep using the term irreconcilable, is because we're not talking about aspects of tailoring and inclusion. Many of the actors that are involved in negotiations are not looking to be included. And as I've said, Government of National Unity or Government of National Accord. Government of National Unity, I'll give a really good example, is built around a three-man presidency that represent Libya's three regions. So on the surface, you would imagine then that the conflict has been between the south, the east and west, Libya's three regions. It hasn't. It has been between the west and the west, the east and the east, and at times the south and the south, the fragmentation that Tim and Alessia have both been talking about. We go back 6 years ago, and we go back to 2015, 7 years ago, and the establishment of the Government of National Accord. That was a 9-man presidency. So how many regions does Libya have? 3. We have 9 because it's everybody accordingly in the tent. But the compromise or the illusion or the logic rather is, oh, well, if we get everyone inside and they're all included, then it's okay, then there will be a compromise. It doesn't work. And the reason being is that the structures that these actors represent are irreconcilable. And I think that's where I start with my process of why things have gone wrong. You can't put these two irreconcilable halves together at the military level because the logic that has brought these two groups together is irreconcilable. On the one hand, Khalifa Haftar's Libyan Arab Armed Forces is built on a tribal logic, which, as many people assume Libya is a tribal country, well, that's partially true. In certain constituencies have more tribal systems, have more tribal culture, and are of an ethnicity that lends itself more to tribalism than others, which are more civic tribes or sedentary tribes. And again, anyone looking at Yemen or looking at other countries across the Middle East and North Africa would realize that to try and simplify what a society looks like is just a joke. It doesn't work that way. It's a complex place. There is a complex number of reasons why people inhabit certain places and how they position themselves or how they posture politically. It can't always be reduced down to what kind of tribe you are or what you aren't. But in the Libyan Armed Forces context, mainly built around tribe, loyalty to the father, because Khalifa Haftar's own sons are in control of the Praetorian Guard of that force. And then it's built around certain Salafi groups or groups with a religious mindset that are essentially loyal to a fatwa and have joined the Libyan Armed Forces. They have come together as a unit and as a structure that if you tamper with the structure, you pull one out, it's like Jenga. The whole thing is going to fall apart. How do you compromise? How do you get to a negotiation table where, technically speaking, you say, we'll pull this part out and it doesn't work that way, right? There's an authoritarian social contract. I mean, Tim has mentioned this idea of a social contract. There's multiple ones across the country. They're just not national, and that's the main problem. And I would say on the opposing side, yes, it's fragmented, but many of those groups that have competed with one another at times come together when they find that they're unified by one single actor, be it Khalifa Haftar since 2014, or be it now very recently with the emergence or the re-emergence of Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi. Now, again, those actors are built in a way or are constructed around this Burkan al-Ghadab, volcano of rage operations room. Again, pulling some of those out is going to have a problem. And we've seen this again before. They've attempted to do that in Tripoli since 2015. They've attempted to do it again in Western Libya since 2017, or the Cairo security talks. And again, so we can see that there has been attempts at doing this, but never structural attempts. And the reason being is that those structures are red lines, and they would destroy the very structures and foundations of which many of these political entrepreneurs that come to the negotiation table have built their power on. And I think that's the major problem with the international approach to Libya, is it's calling many of these individuals spoilers, or some of them have been called political dinosaurs, or some of them being called strongmen and other words around it. But it's imagining that they have too much power, and we have a process that's January 2020, that if you engage in that process with good faith, the Berlin process, you would have to neutralize those structures and unify them into one single subservient neutral state institution. That's what it says on the tin. None of them have been doing this because, again, the international actors that acted very loudly between 2019 and 2020 have now become quite quiet since 2021. But I don't think in good faith they've changed their positions. We can take examples like Egypt, for example, now controls the military portfolio. It had for several years, and it had been doing that since at least 2017. It talks very quietly, engages with Abdelhamid Dbeibeh in prestigious, the current interim prime minister, in prestigious kind of and formal settings. But the question of power is very clear for Egypt, that the Libyan National Army or the Libyan Armed Forces, that should be held by a particular group of individuals. It should be structured around tribes, and we're not going to compromise around that. The same could be said around other aspects of the state building process, but it's been throttled and strangled since 2019 or since 2020. And so we now see the same issues that were there pre-war are now here again in 2022, and there's been kind of no movement on that. What I would say, a final aspect about the international community's position on this, is that they are as much to blame as the local actors. I mean, the local actors will move around and posture, but they have skin in the game. They're going to have to live with whatever state they inherit or they build as a result of that process. But the international actors that were involved in the conflict are now involved in the architecture and have been rewarded, with the architecture of Libya's state building process. That's no better than involving many of the spoilers on the ground locally. So I think it's going to require some sort of comprehensive relook, not only in terms of who we bring to the table at the local level, but also at the international level. Can actors that were responsible for Libya's conflict over the last several years, can they be, are they the adequate custodians for Libya's peace process and its state building process over the next several? But to leave it with this, I think it will take years, irrespective of what is put on the table by the UN over the next several weeks. It will take absolutely years, because the question is always going to be, which of those issues do you want to solve? Not which of the issues will you solve. I mean, we had a year to solve this constitutional aspect, the foundation that Tim was talking about. We have the electoral law that was passed by decree and not by parliamentary vote. Those things didn't happen yesterday. They happened in March. They've been going on for several months now. For that to happen at the 25th hour, 2 days before elections. And again, a final point on this, yes, the elections were delayed. No one can give a single reason why they were delayed. None of the international actors or the local institutions have consensus around why it was delayed. So everyone sees this problem or this dilemma or this crisis from a number of different vantage points or from their own personal interests. Unless we have consensus over even what to call this crisis and even what to call the dilemma as it's, where the dilemma starts and where it ends, we're not going to move forward. So again, I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic around that, but I think it's really, it's much worse than we see on the surface. If no one is calling what the problem is by its real name, then how do you call for a solution?
Well, Dr. Malkanji, given this laundry list of issues that Anas has pointed out, and this idea that we've been discussing here around having milestones to sort of pass rather than sort of set dates. In your view, considering all of this, what is the most realistic and way to move forward on this roadmap, and what is the most realistic way to approach holding elections, considering all of these issues that we've been discussing?
Unfortunately, in this context, I'm afraid that it's more realistic to underline the difficulties to imagine a roadmap toward holding the election as fixing new election dates. The failure of Libya's parliamentary committee to set a new date for the country's election has dimmed hopes for a new start for the country, and the chances of another conflict are so high. Although in this phase, no one faction, in my opinion, appears strong enough to overthrow the situation and mount a takeover. The most critical issues remain. There was, as Anna said, no agreement for the next election date. The Electoral Commission is proposing January 24. The Parliament proposed a reshuffling of the interim government in Tripoli until a new roadmap for election can be agreed on. And there were many lateral talks among different candidates, such as that with after the ex-interior minister Bashaga and former deputy prime minister Maiting in Benghazi, that underlined the risk of an evolving scenario. Everyone is continuing to look at self-interest, and they are not looking at an elite turnover that Libyans are waiting for. The risk is that this political crisis could fuel local dispute between armed groups in Tripoli. For example, in the West, we might see the international states trying to consolidate their gains, especially in this phase where there is no agreement on what the next steps will look like. On the other side, Libyans fear that disputes over the current electoral process could trigger a crisis like that of 2014, when Libyan institutions were split between West and Eastern faction. But in my opinion, while a prolonged delay could increase the risk of derailing the ongoing peace process, it is also true, and we need to underline this, that a contested election conducted without a shared agreement on rules and eligible candidates would represent a risk for stability. The next week, as Anna said, are crucial in trying to save the entire electoral process and this precarious situation. In the first round of presidential election actually take place at the beginning of this year, in such a polarized country, the result, whatever it may be, is likely to be disputed, and there may be a future armed conflict which would delegitimize any new political scenario. If this happened, the parliamentary election would be postponed indefinitely. So the situation is very complex. A more likely scenario, perhaps, is that covert effort by certain Libyan political groups will cause the election to be postponed to a yet to be defined date, thus increasing the population disillusionment with a ruling class that is incapable of addressing the real needs of its citizens. Although disappointing, this scenario poses the least risk to security. A conflict triggered by fraud and subsequent dispute would be devastating, not least because its repercussion would be long-lasting.
So Tim Eaton, Anas Ogulmati has said that this process could actually take years, not months, to actually resolve these issues. First of all, do you agree with that? And in your view, what are the prospects of these issues being sorted out, any time in the near future?
Well, I think Anas is absolutely correct to call these structural issues. This isn't simply an issue of when the election date will be or a minor amendment to a law that can solve these types of problems. The problem is a system of government. Clearly, 40 years under the system of Muammar Gaddafi created a society set against itself, massive, ineffective government systems, state institutions, the evisceration of a private sector, and no real means of trusting fellow citizens. So these aren't things that can be quickly resolved. What I would say is that what needs to change is not simply a discussion of process of the next thing along the timeline. I think it has to be saying, okay, well, if these are the structural problems, if we need to change the way that the Libyan state serves its citizens, how do we go about that? What needs to happen for that to take place? And you can see that as it's currently framed, effectively winning the elections and becoming president of a system where all of the resources are centrally distributed is a winner takes all. So that means that there is very little trust that whoever gets into that position won't just use that money for their own ends, their own supporters. You have to change that way so that those threats are diminished. And so my perspective on this is that there needs to be some kind of compact among Libyans to place upon an incoming government so that there are some parameters for what that government should do. Actually, whilst you could sit on many social forums, you could talk to many Libyans who will disagree on whether person A or person B is the right person, or perhaps about a timeline. Many of the problems that Libya faces, there's quite a lot of consensus. There's a consensus that there needs to be a degree of decentralization of authority from Tripoli. There's a consensus that the state needs to operate in a different way. So I think it's about changing the conversation to be about those things so that, for example, you don't need to have your client in charge of the state's resources of the central bank in order to make sure that you can import goods into the country. You don't need to have a minister from a certain tribe to ensure that jobs go to that tribe. Fundamentally, that's the change that you're trying to engender. So having that kind of consensus about a program for a new government, a program that could be supported by the international community in a proactive way, rather than a process which is guarded against preventing person A or person B from being in power, is the way to go. And I think that's the shift that needs to take place. It's a very difficult one, but actually I think that there are means of doing it because the Libyan population broadly sees the benefit of that. People are tired. They're fed up with electricity blackouts. They're fed up with their money not going so far. They're fed up with the lack of opportunity. They see the money that's wasted by the political elites. So changing the conversation to be about those things, what can a government deliver? How should the government deliver that? That, I think, is the change that needs to be engendered through elections. And we can see, actually, the current government has not done a lot for Libyans in the grand scheme of things, but even one or two promises of benefits for those young people looking to get married, of promises of some projects, were greeted with such enthusiasm because the Libyan population really has got nothing from its government since 2011. And so that's, I think, the way that we have to go, moving away from the discussion of who to a discussion of how. That's not easy, but I think that requires quite a rigorous, internationally supported process and isn't just the result of a power sharing deal between an armed leader such as Haftar and someone else, because their interests are antithetical to that type of approach.
Thank you, Tim. And so we're running short on time, but I want to just kind of have our other two guests address this last point that you very fortuitously brought up, Tim, is this idea of, moving away from the who to the how, I think, as you put it very succinctly. Anas and Gramati, I'll start with you on this. What is the how then moving forward? Like, if we're looking at all of these issues that we've been discussing here, of course this is a big question, but if you can very briefly, give us an idea of moving to these points that Tim is speaking of in terms of, addressing these structural issues that you and the other guests have brought up. How do we actually do that? How do we actually get to a point where these issues can start to be addressed?
Well, before I start that, I think I'm going to put Tim's name on my election ballot and try and see if we can get him elected as president, because it was a perfect vision of, and again, a reflection, to be honest, very honest, a reflection of the way that most Libyans, when they look at this issue and they think, how have we gone for the last 10 years so far away from what was envisaged in 2011? And I think these are the questions, and they were the subjects that were on the table in 2011. To think that now, 10, 11 years later, that these issues are so far away, and we're kind of in this very strange conundrum where the three main actors that are on the ballot card are either the son of the dictator, the guy that stabbed him in the back, or the guy that made his billions out of him. I mean, it's an insane thing to think that was going to be. No one would have predicted it. I wouldn't have, and I would have lost a serious amount of money had I bet on that. But anyway, I think the way that to go around the how is a very simple sense and a very complex one. But the first is, you have to bring in people that want to have those conversations. You can log into Clubhouse, for example, and any evening of this week, and you'll find Libyans that dominate these rooms with questions like that. They're constantly having these discussions. The problem is that they're not reflected. They're not reflected amongst the political elite that has, as Tim has said, for the last 10 years, they have let down Libyans because, number one, they have been enjoying exhausting Libya's wealth, and profiting by it. There's been hundreds of billions that have been spent. If anyone could point me somewhere in Tripoli or Benghazi or Sabah or anywhere else where they think that it's been spent and that they've had some return on that investment, I'd love to see it, because I can't see anything that has radically changed since 2011. Bab al-Aziziyah, Gaddafi's palace, still pretty much lies in ruin. I remember in the first months of the revolution, people were talking about building a park there so that you wouldn't have to see this ostentatious nightmare of a building and that Libyans could move on. Even the symbolic change hasn't come. But as Tim has mentioned, I mean, a couple of things about, not even infrastructural projects, wiping up a few streets and painting some streets with new paint has seen someone like Abdelhamid Dbeibeh reach up to 68, 70 points in the polls. It's insane that he was a political outsider and an unknown figure to many internationals and many Libyans until this year. So I think it's a very easy sell when it comes down to it, because if you want to reflect what is popular on the ground, then you need to have those conversations. I think any willing or budding political entrepreneur, would have an easy ride with that. The question is the conditions. And again, it can go back to these very fine points that we've been making around the elections. If those elections take place over the ones that were supposed to take place 10 days ago, just remember this. Yes, there were 100 candidates that were registered. How many of those candidates had time to go out and canvass? They were probably given around 7 days. So when Libyans were coming to the elections, the 2.4, 2.5 million that registered, how many of them were voting for a vision of the future, an idea of how the how, essentially, of what the how we should govern this country? How many of them were going back and saying, I'm really worried that the guy that stabbed him in the back, the guy that stole his money, or his son is going to win? It was a negative vote. And I think that's, again, I'm not going to say that that's essentially all that was there when people came to register. But you look at the uptick in registration around the receiving of ballots around the registration of those candidates, it was huge. And I think that's a real danger, because Libyans are beginning to believe that elections or position elections as something that they fear, that someone may come out of this that poses an existential threat. And that's been the case now for the last several years. It's not a preferential aspect. I don't really like him. I don't like the way he looks. I don't like the way they talk. It's, if he comes to power, he might kill me. And I think that's something that many constituencies across the country feel. And that has starved the political debate from being about the how. But also, again, I'll leave it on this final point about the international community. They have chosen to engage those individuals and keep them politically relevant for the last several years. So I don't want anyone to get off here scot-free. If the international community continues to engage with these, for lack of a better term, political entrepreneurs and opportunists who don't represent either the constituents on the ground when they're weaponized, or the constituents on the ground when they're believing and thinking about how to improve their country, how to go around the how, then why are we engaging them? And I think, why are we tailoring the election process, the political process, the security process around their tastes? So I think, again, if it was to try and have that how, it's very simple. Those conversations are already happening. Libyans are looking for a fresh way out. Many Libyans turned out to try to register their candidacy for the presidential elections. But if you're going to starve the political process and design it around these figures, then we're not going to move anywhere forward.
And Dr. Malkanji, I'll give you the last word. The same question of what concrete steps need to be taken in order to actually move this roadmap forward?
I perfectly agree with Anas that, in my opinion, Libyans need a small act, something also of symbolic. But I think that there is a general skepticism shared by part of the population about the capacity of political personality to lead to a real solution. There was a past made up of egotism of various personalities, high level of corruption, incompetence of political class, and the presence of a real problem, like Tim underlined before. So in my opinion, I think that there is a need to change this type of political environment. Try to find someone that is less linked to local groups and tribes, and more linked with and more committed to improve this condition of the Libyan. In my opinion, the problem is linked with this class of politicians, and of course with other problems that are on the stage, as Anas and Tim underlined before. So in my opinion, we need to start from the political environment. This is really important to give a new hope for the Libyans, and maybe a new hope for the election, for the new election, for the next election.
Thank you, Dr. Malkanji. And, there's, of course, tons more we could discuss, but for the sake of time, we'll have to leave it there. Dr. Alessia Malkanji, Tim Eaton, Anas El-Gomati, thank you so much for joining us today. We addressed a number of issues, and of course, there's so much more to address. So, we look forward to perhaps having you again in the future to hopefully discuss more positive developments. But thank you again so much for joining us. We really appreciate it on TRT World Forum Digital Debates.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks so much.